Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics Podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast. I'm Nathaniel, the dialogue partner for our guests.
And I'm Daniel, the host for the show.
Today we're joined again by Rory McEntee, the president and executive director of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which he and I co-founded with Father Adam Bucko. Rory holds a PhD in Theological and Philosophical Studies in Religion from Drew University and has co-authored the New Monasticism and Interspiritual Manifesto for Contemplative Living and authored the soon-to-be-published The Sacred Secular Binary, Challenging the Divide in University Culture and Democratic Societies.
Hey, Rory. It's great to be back with you again.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Nathaniel and Daniel.
So we launched the podcast back in 2022 with you as our first guest. And on that first episode, we focused on interspirituality and new monasticism and got a bit of backstory on the origin of the Charis Foundation. Today, we'd like to drill in a little more specifically on implementing a spiritual and interspiritual path and the current activities of the Charis Foundation. When we first had you on, we discussed three primary ways of practicing interspirituality that you and Adam outlined in detail in your book, The New Monasticism. So I just wanted to review those three kind of models to get us situated. And as I understand it, these three models or ways of being interspiritual are: one, as a practitioner deeply rooted in one tradition who's porous to and in dialogue with other traditions. Two, as a practitioner with multiple spiritual or religious belongings. And three, as a practitioner who's not necessarily rooted in one or multiple traditions, but who's engaged with traditions, revelation, spirit, wisdom, etc., from many different sources. Is that a fair characterization? And do either of you have anything you want to add or clarify to those three models?
Well, one thing that's coming up for me, and Nathaniel, it'd be interesting to see you kind of add into this too. I think those are good distinctions, Daniel. We've had them for a long time, but I also think that they were something we came up with, close to 15 years ago now. And we tend to talk about interspirituality a little bit differently these days. It's nice for understanding that interspiritual includes people who are in a particular tradition, very devoted to their tradition, and really want to live out the spiritual journey within it. That is wonderful and very supported by how we understand interspirituality. Other people may be in more than one tradition or see themselves as even belonging to more than one tradition. And that's also true. And other people, like you said, may be walking a path that's more purely interspiritual. But I think as we go on with our conversation today, that will continually be nuanced. Mm-hmm. As we put some more years under our belt, I think for us, we get a little bit of clarity around what it means to walk, say, a quote unquote interspiritual path. And maybe just for right now to nuance it, because I think we'll have a lot of conversation around this, is I don't think there is really a path separate from traditions right now, in the sense that the traditions represent thousands of years of human experimentation in what can help a spiritual journey move forward. And one would be kind of foolish, I think, to not take advantage of the many experiments that are going on in traditions and that have been formulated carefully, particularly as one goes deeper on the journey. So I'll just stop there for now, because this will be some more stuff that we'll be getting into in the conversation.
Yeah, we do spend less time talking about models of how to be interspiritual now. And a lot of that was a response to people questioning, this use of this word. So we were pointing out, well, this is an actuality, and many people, have different versions of how they're being interspiritual. It comes up less where we're talking now. And that's just interesting to observe too. But mostly I'm interested in what Rory just said about, you said something like, I don't think we can have an interspirituality now without traditions. And I agree. What would it mean to even talk about interspirituality without historical traditions? That means you're trying to talk in a vacuum. You're thinking of an abstracted interspirituality, but we live in context. And in our context, there's thousands upon thousands of years of tradition informing everything that we think, including about interspirituality. And so it's not like in the way we're talking that they're competing. It's that everything is informing everything else. And in the original definition of interspirituality by Brother Wayne Teasdale, who was Rory's teacher, who coined the term, he was saying that all traditions are interconnected because everything in the universe is interconnected. So dependent co-origination, as it's articulated in Buddhism, if that's considered a truth, then every religion has to be connected because everything is. And that's true here about interspirituality. Like, it's birthed from and lives in the context of everything that's been before which is currently coexisting with it. It's just now being named as something among everything else. And I think we could see it as growing. It's forming. It's being formed by and forming, and we're watching the evolution even as we participate in it. And so the language is changing. How we're addressing things is changing.
I might be jumping on top of you here, Daniel. Make one more quick comment, maybe.
Oh, good.
I loved what you said, Natana. I was really struck by just the recognition that so much of what we think about spirituality, whether we like it or not, is colored by the thousands of years of traditions. And Western culture is very colored by Christianity, whether we know it or not. But anytime we're talking about the spirit or the guidance of the spirit, very Christian orientation to the contemplative path, because it's part of our culture. And it's good to recognize that we are enculturated and that affects not just like in some limited way, but in a positive way that gives us some grounding in our ways of thinking about the spiritual journey, which is just helpful to recognize. And interspirituality recognizes the deepening dialogue between these many traditions, and then always points us back to the spiritual journey when we're talking about religion or religious dialogue. It makes the focus of it our own transformation and the transformation of the world always. And I think that's one of the great things that it brings to the table is that focus.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, I'm bringing up these three models because I want to kind of focus in on that third definition, more of people who are walking a pure interspiritual path, if you will, one that is less rooted in specific traditions. And part of my interest in going more deeply into this kind of interspirituality for this episode is, in my experience, that's where way more people are at. There's a lot of people who are identifying as spiritual but not religious, who really don't have any strong connection to a particular tradition. Maybe they have borrowed practices from these traditions, something like a yoga practice or even a meditation practice, but they're not directly connected to a teacher or to a religious community. And so I think there's a lot of interest there in question. And I think from what you're saying, I want to maybe push back a little bit about these traditions, because I think if we're taking this view, as Nathaniel was saying, of everything being interconnected and reality is reality, no matter how you look at it, then there seems to be a possibility of getting to the very heart or the very essence of oneself and reality itself outside of tradition by deep inquiry. I'm thinking about people like Carl Jung or Albert Einstein, who are taking more of a scientific route and not necessarily so influenced by traditions. Of course, Jung was very much thinking about and looking into traditional practices and stuff. But as far as I know, he was not a practitioner of these traditions. And yet he seems to be incredibly tapped in a way that I think many people embedded in traditions are not. And that seems to be a possibility that interspirituality also encompasses, that interspirituality goes far beyond just what we would normally think of as religious and spiritual traditions, and is more this impulse of the spirit, of a deep inquiry. What the heck is going on in my heart, in my mind, in the world, and exploring that and going deep, maybe without a teacher or a teaching in particular. So before going forward, I guess I'm curious about any reflection on that kind of pushback around the role of traditional traditions, if you will.
Yep. Go ahead, Rory.
Thank you for the question, Daniel. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think what you're saying is very true, and within the interspiritual is a recognition that it's the fact of being a human being that opens up the possibility of a transformative spiritual journey to us. And that can be accessed in many different ways. And many people access a depth outside of traditional religions. And that's always happened, I think, and is happening a lot today. Nature is certainly a big source of inspiration. A lot of different ways. People do it through yoga, people do it through art, through movies, through philosophy. And so I think all of that is embraced by interspirituality and recognizing that spiritual depth is about coming more aligned and more perceptive of the actual nature of reality. And that can happen in all walks of life, everywhere that you are. On top of that, well, maybe I'll hand it off to Nathaniel here, and then I have one more comment, but I'll let it keep forming.
I guess I'm thinking about two things in what you brought up. The first thing is, clarifying what we mean. And you were just speaking and you said, some people are actually trying to walk a pure interspiritual path. And from one perspective, okay, that's what we were saying about interconnectedness in religions. There is no pure interspiritual path, abstracted or separated from the traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that interspiritual path, they're drawing on Rumi and they're drawing on the Buddha and so on. But I understood what you actually meant, which is there are people that are trying to walk this fourth way of being interspiritual as a path and not being exclusive in any tradition, that they're trying to walk a personal spirituality that is just radically connected to kind of all being and are exploring whether that's possible. And then the thing about, a Jung or an Einstein, we think of Einstein as a humanist and certainly as a scientist, as a physicist. And yet he had a sense of something profound in which he was participating. And, you can read some writings from Einstein where you go, that's wisdom. Something in that human has become refined into a perspective and a way of being that affects the world positively. And that's what we want. Like, I don't care what you call it. And then Jung, certainly. Now, yeah, he's, dipping his ewer, as it were, in all the traditions and knows them profoundly. But is he in any of them exclusively? Not at all. And so it brings up this question, which we've addressed in different ways. In the past, when Rory and I are talking to colleagues who are questioning interspirituality, and they're saying things like, well, how are you going to go deep if you're not in the traditions? You're always going to be on the surface if you're not in traditions. And, we used to spend time answering that question, but it occurred to us after a while, where are all these deep people in these traditions? It used to be put out there as an assumption, like, how can you go deep without all the tools of Christianity and the path that's laid out? How are you going to go deep?
Mm-hmm.
And we used to answer that like that was a real solid question. But then it occurs to us, like, you look around, look at the vast body of Christians. Where's all the depth? It's no guarantee of depth. And so I think the thing we have to start looking at, in terms of interspirituality is what's the X factor? Because having the tools didn't mean that you used them, and having the tools didn't mean that they got used right, because it's still a minority thing to get to wisdom and this profound experience.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't take that question seriously anymore. How are you going to go deep without this? Because it doesn't produce that depth in everybody, even when they're in it. And so I think interspirituality in some ways does have to be about structures of maturation, but we have to look much more closely at these X factors again, the nuances. What is shaping maturity? Yeah, so I'll stop there.
I think that's really the key question. What is shaping maturity? I'm no fan of the spiritual marketplace of today, but it doesn't mean that there isn't some really good stuff going on within it and within things that don't look like traditional paths. And the criticism you often hear is that people are shallow. They're just jumping around from this to that and doing a kind of new agey bricolage of different stuff that makes them feel good. But like Nathaniel was saying, especially on the shallow side, there is in every tradition, thousands, millions of people that participate in a very shallow way. So some of the advantages of an interspiritual perspective is that it's clearly concentrated on a contemplative, spiritual, transformative journey, so that when we engage with religion, what it's actually about, coming to learn reality in a deeper way. And it puts the responsibility back on oneself. It really points us back to oneself, like you were saying, Daniel, of tuning into what is it in me that actually has this potential for a transformative journey, for maturing, for growing into expansive spaces of compassion and love and wisdom and insight into the nature of reality, because it's part of the human condition. And so the advantage of interspirituality is it focuses on those key points. But then what people really respond to is spiritual depth. And so the question of maturity and how one, over a long period of time, gains spiritual depth and maturity on the journey is really the key question. And what we're seeing now is that, that can be done within a tradition. On rare occasions, it can be done completely outside of any traditions. Like Jung was working with the traditions, but it would be, he's got a generally Christian overview if you kind of look at his work in a broader perspective. But what happened with Jung's work is it became a tradition for a lot of people. And science is also a very interesting question. And someone like Einstein, who was open to a greater mystery in life, I think science can be revelatory. My great teacher, Father Thomas Keating, would talk about scientists as some of the new prophets, and that nature as a book of revelation is equal to the Bible. And that now that book of revelation is not just the beauty and transcendence of nature, but it is learning how the world works. And when we look at particularly the different things in physics, we begin to see a revelation of reality that very closely dovetails with what many mystics and many traditions have described. It's not exactly the same, but it does seem to be teaching us about the depths of reality in a similar way. So it's a fascinating development, and it was certainly one that my teacher was very high on, Father Thomas. You hear him talk about it a lot in his later videos. So these are all good questions, but that question of maturity and how do you harness those initial impulses to have a spiritual path, and that you begin to experience perhaps outside of traditions, but then how to commit in a disciplined way that can take you through decades of practice to deepening maturity is one of the challenges of an interspiritual path. Mm-hmm. And partly, I think one of the great challenges to the work of the future, to have experiments that look to do that and learn from them.
Yeah. That's where I want to go from here, is really about how does one implement an interspiritual path, and what might that look like? What might the pitfalls be? And before just throwing it back to y'all, I just want to name a little bit of the assumptions that I'm hearing kind of latent within part of what you guys are saying. which for me goes back to what I was talking about in terms of just a deep inquiry and exploration, kind of regardless of tradition. I think when we're talking about traditions, we're often talking about them in the abstract and separated from life itself. And I think in a lot of ways, that's a very new thing for humans. And it seems that as societies and civilizations have become more advanced, if you will, I don't mean that in a sense of better in any way, but just more technologically advanced, more structured, larger and larger societies, there's become more of a sense of religion as its own thing. But I think when we look back into our history throughout the planet, we see peoples living in a very spiritual way, but in a way where religion and spirituality is part and parcel of life, is not separated from family, from politics, from just society. And so I think we're talking about interspirituality in some ways as a kind of new impulse, but it's also this very old impulse, and maybe something we're talking about is a healing of a kind of very masculine divide between religion and the secular. And maybe there's less of a divide that exists in reality, that there's just life, and that going deep into any one arena of life, one can reach the center, if you will, and that can look like many different things. And that is not necessarily having to go through what we would typically call religion or a spiritual practice that is different than the practice of life. So with that named, I'm kind of curious what you guys have to say about that. And then again, kind of reframing this question I'm hoping to get to is this one of what does it actually look like to walk and deepen into the interspiritual path we're talking about, especially one that is less directly connected to a particular tradition. People who maybe have an aversion to studying with a spiritual teacher or master, or don't really want to go into these established religions or have these kind of traumas about a dogmatic religion that they're actually running away from, but they still have a deep spiritual impulse.
Mm-hmm. The thing about life, we talk about this often. I sometimes don't like using the word spirituality because depending on who I'm talking to, for them, it often represents, in Rory's own work, a sacred secular binary.
Mm-hmm.
So when I use spiritual, they often assume that I mean something different from, say, science. Like, oh, it's spiritual or it's scientific. It's sacred or it's secular.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's problematic language. And again, to go back to Brother Wayne Teasdale, when he was defining interspirituality, he was also redefining spirituality for himself. And one of the things he says there, he says, if you're saying by spirituality something opposed to science, then that's not what we're talking about. So when that's assumed, then I don't want to talk about spirituality. It's a vague word that we use to grease the wheels in discourse in some ways. But really, there's only life. There's just life in all of its manifestations. And that's what Brother Wayne was trying to say. That spirituality, so named for him, included all of life. But if you were engaged in a kind of secular scientism, where you reduce everything to kind of brain activity or something, and he's saying, I'm not down with that. But good science itself is exploratory of a mystery. It's always on an edge and continually reaching out. Even the inner worlds are getting infinitely refined and described. And so it's exploratory, and so is spirituality. And so both, in a sense, exist in the mystery. That's what we mean by spirituality, not this secular as opposed to sacred thing. And then, what I like about what you were saying about maybe everything in life is a possible doorway into the center and to maturity. And there's a great example of that in the great Hindu saint Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And because he was a worshiper of the Devi, or the goddess, which is understood in that tradition to be Shakti, the divine energy. And the divine energy, in a sense, in the universe is all that exists. It's just taking different forms. That energy is forming into all these different things. And as a worshiper of that divine energy, that Shakti, he would go out of his way to meet the finest classical violinist or the highest level physicist. He would try to meet all these people, these artists and writers, because that was Shakti manifesting at a very refined level. And he wanted to meet her in all her forms. And for him, they were all doorways back to the center. That's another kind of view on that there is a great, great practitioner from within a tradition who recognize that traditions are relative and that the divine is just reality itself, and you're meeting it constantly. You can never not meet it.
Right.
And so then it has to be true in that relationship that everything can be a doorway to this ultimate manifestation.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you, Nathaniel. I think, the false dichotomy between the sacred secular binary is definitely something to recognize in our modern age. It's really an invention of Protestant Christianity, and before that, and everywhere on the planet, people tended, for our entire human history, tended to live within a sacred canopy, what's sometimes called a sacred canopy, where everything from the authoritative governmental level all the way down to the lowest places in life was assigned, usually in a hierarchical way, which is one of the advantages of what the secular, I guess, has brought, is a greater sense of our equality. But they were all encompassed within a sacred kind of hierarchy or a sacred canopy, and were seen as all part of life. And today there is this false divide, and I think part of the work is bridging the positive senses of equality in a paradoxical way, even a return of the feminine, which even in these sacred canopies all over the world, unless we go all the way back to indigenous traditions, were still very patriarchal, even though there wasn't a sacred secular break. Somehow the secular has also opened up a greater sense of equality among all of us and diversity, but we've lost the sacredness in it. And what new kind of sacred openings can come through that can help heal some of the, to be quite straight, the very highly patriarchal concepts and even feeling of the journey that come from our traditions for the most part, because they were all defined by man's experience in the world, because it was men who were just doing the writing and teaching for every tradition we just about know of, certainly all the religious traditions. And so 2 other points I would just add to this. First, I would say, we've talked about kind of the scientific and the spiritual journey, and Nathaniel had some beautiful things to say about that. There's also a sense that on the spiritual journey, especially as it gets deeper, there's an initial stage where you're exploring and you're finding what speaks to you and what you open up to and resonate with. And maybe you have some ecstatic experiences. And these are beautiful. This is an opening to the journey. This is meant to help us commit to the journey, to know that it's real, to know there's a depth to reality. But as we continue to move forward, we start to get into some difficult phases, and we start to have to be a little bit more clear about what we're doing, or we can get sidetracked. One of the great advantages of traditions is they've explored the many ways we can go off base, even when we're fully committed to a spiritual journey. And they try to create structures to help that. One of those structures in a spiritual journey is a sense that it itself is scientific. In order to proceed into the depths of this mystery, you're running your own scientific experiments in life as part of life. How am I reacting in this situation? What are the emotions that are in me? When I do this practice every day for a month, do I find myself reacting differently? I have this intuition about this person. I think this person has a deep spirituality. So then what I can do, I can recognize I have this intuition. I can follow up on it by spending time with the person, a heightened sensitivity around them. And then as an experiment, I learned discernment. Oh, maybe they weren't exactly what I thought. So maybe that intuition I had toward them was something different. And I need to think a little, instead of just keep doing the same things over and over. When we bring a scientific mind into the depths of our life, especially around the spiritual journey and how we are being transformed, a huge help. In fact, almost necessary. It's one of those things that can keep us from ending up in cul-de-sacs. And just the final thing I would say, and this seems really important in leading it kind of more into your last question, Daniel, about how does one actually walk a path. In today's world where we have so much communication and we have an opportunities that no one's ever had before to read so much of the sacred literature in different traditions, to have opportunities to have deep dialogue with advanced practitioners in different traditions. I mean, even Tibetan Buddhism, it's just the last 20, 30 years that we've started to have almost any texts at all. And they just keep getting translated more and more. So one of the things for today that we can look at is what actually have these traditions look like in the different religious traditions, contemplative paths, right? And what you tend to find, and this is, I think, a point of real importance, is a lot of overlap in practice, a lot of overlap in what can be called, in some sense, states of consciousness, even stages of consciousness, a kind of general trajectory to the path in general. What the evidence tends to point towards is that these are, for most people, part of the spiritual path. And whether you're in a tradition or whether you're outside a tradition and trying to walk a more inner spiritual path that's not particularly embedded, these same structures are going to be there. And the same kinds of practices are going to be helpful. When you see very different cultures, very different theological frameworks, religious traditions throughout all periods of human history, discovering something like a spiritual path, articulating it, coming up with practices, describing it, and then you see these overlaps and commonalities. That's what a scientist would do. That's pointing to something very deep in our human nature. It's pointing us back to, you can kind of triangulate around the human condition in a sense and get a deeper sense of what it actually takes to walk an authentic spiritual journey, whether or not it's in a tradition or not. It's not like you get out of that stuff if you're not in a tradition. There's still going to be dark nights. There's still going to be a need for daily practice. There's still going to likely be a need for silence in our practice. All these things that we find in the traditional contemplative paths are still going to need to be engaged in some way for someone walking an inner spiritual path.
Mm-hmm. If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening. I guess I'm curious to just simplify. I know my question was a little bit all over the place, but let's bring it just all the way down from any kind of theoretical discussion and more into just the practical. People come to you and they say, I feel a deep spiritual impulse, but I'm not interested in the religion I was raised in, or I was raised with no religion, but I feel this deep impulse. I want to develop myself. I want to be a more complete, better person, of more service, more in touch, etc. How should I proceed? What would you two say? And I know that this is also part of the work of Charis. So how do you respond to these kinds of inquiries?
I really honor that question. I think, and that was a question that wasn't honored for a long time. People have been saying that for quite some time. And we're often being rejected very quickly for asking in that manner. And I think now is a time where we really do have to honor that there is this impulse in us to seek, we could call it wholeness. And that whole, in a sense, is boundless and participates in a mystery. Something's calling us into a greater reality, a more profound reality. And somebody is saying that when they're bringing up that question. And they're feeling that the profundity of what they're asking doesn't feel like it will be held by the existing structures that they know. And now I might question what they mean by religion, and I've written some on this. I take a kind of a pragmatist approach to religion where I say, how does it function? So religion is what you do to cultivate what we're often calling the spirit.
Mhm.
And so in my way of thinking, you won't get away from religion because anything you do to cultivate that spirit will be religious activity.
Mhm.
But I also understand that thing about not feeling held. And so one of the places Rory and I have gone with honoring that question is if we're going to boil down a spiritual practice to an irreducible place, like
Mhm.
you're going to get down to two basic components, you need a way of getting high or deep. And so we call this the vertical dimension
Mhm.
or vertical access that will get you high or deep. And then you also have to be able to cultivate a horizontal dimension, which is getting broad, and reaching into life, letting your spirituality reach into life.
Mhm.
And for that, we recommend a kind of tranquility-based meditation practice, and then a contemplative practice, meaning even as simple as spiritual reading. You're probably not going to get away from feeding yourself something good and then doing something to cultivate dimensions of being that aren't usually cultivated, at least not in our society. And so that's kind of where we've started in answering that question, trying to give somebody, oh, you can start here. And we're trying to be humble in that because in the interspiritual discourse out there, some people have made very grand claims for interspirituality, like we're now in an interspiritual time and we don't have to do any of that stuff from the past. I'm like, no, interspirituality is birthing right now, which means it's a baby, but it's a real thing and it's growing. So we're trying to start small and humble in how we answer that question. And I think Rory can talk more about how we hold those two dimensions. I mean, if you want to, Rory, you can go anywhere you want. You're free.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an excellent question. When someone begins to feel that impulse, the first thing to tell them is it's real. It's a genuine impulse that is part of our human condition. And it's not just a wooey kind of thing. It's not something that's just in our head. It is the deeper nature of reality that is already within us calling to itself. It's the fact of our divine image or our Buddha nature that gives us both a certain dissatisfaction with life. This is what the Buddhists call dukkha, that something in us will never be satisfied or will never actually find happiness through the things of this world. And something in us knows this. And it can manifest as a general dissatisfaction or a lack of the happiness we thought we would get when we pursue some great goal and maybe even achieve it beyond our wildest dreams. And then sit there like Alexander the Great conquering the world saying, okay, what do I do now? This didn't fill the hole, right? And the other way it manifests is as that impulse you're talking about that recognizes there is a depth to life and a depth to reality that we are connected to, and that is calling us in some kind of yearning that bubbles up from inside. Because it's not just something that's potentially there, but it's evolution itself that is pushing us forward as a human family that wants to mature, that wants to find expressions of its deeper nature through human consciousness, which we experience as love and compassion and equality and spaciousness and peace. And that impulse is recognizing that that possibility is there. And so you have to water it, find a way to commit to it. And then as you go deeper on the spiritual journey, always recognize that that is what you're committing to, even if you go into a tradition, even if you go into a particular path. It's this deeper nature, this impulse that was already there prior to any tradition, prior to hearing anything about it. It's the most natural thing there is. If we remember that that's what we're committing to, maybe it can also lower some of our fears of engaging with traditions and some of their teachings as well, which can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And, and to be very practical about it, we wrote about some of this in the New Monasticism book. Again, these overlaps between traditions that tend to be the core of a spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing I would point people directly to. And we have a whole list of them, I think, in that introductory chapter. But one of the most fundamental is a daily practice. And I really believe some kind of practice of silence on a daily basis. Because I think until we're able to slow our mind down and get out of our thoughts to some degree and recognize that we are not our thoughts and have some sense of that deeper reality beyond those, becomes really difficult to make progress on the journey. Not necessarily to have experiences, but spiritual experiences are not always signs of progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so a daily practice that resonates with you and that begins to bring, a serious depth of silence into your life day after day, like I'm being on a treadmill day after day, be the first thing I point people to and recommend for someone who's feeling that impulse.
Mm-hmm.
And as Nathaniel said, we teach a kind of an interspiritual version of meditation we call Charis Meditation. It's really based on centering prayer from Father Thomas Keating, but we present it in an interspiritual way, but the basic dynamics of the practice remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the way one experiences it as one matures on the practice and continues to do it, the psychological effects are the psychological effects, and they will still happen. And that doesn't require you to be Christian in any way.
I see so many roads leading out of this, many side paths, and I'm just aware of time and wanting to, focus a little bit, but just to name that there's a lot of questions that come up there, because it sounds like this Charis meditation is really more that cultivation of the vertical access, that high and deep. And then there's a whole question around how does one cultivate that horizontal access, and what does ethical behavior and guidelines for that behavior and engagement with life look like in the interspiritual path. So maybe you can touch on that. But the next question that feels integral to talking about an interspiritual path is the question of community. I think one of the things that is fantastic about the established religions is the way it provides community, that you can go on Sunday morning to church or Friday evening to the mosque and pray with hundreds or even thousands of people, or even a smaller group, but you have people to practice with. And in the interspiritual landscape, there becomes a real question. If everybody is drawing from different sources and different practices, how do interspiritual people practice together? And what does supportive community look like?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious about that in a general sense. And with time in mind, I'm also curious about how Charis is addressing these questions beyond the Charis meditation that you guys have been talking about. What are some of the ways in which you guys are trying to provide resources for interspiritual practice and interspiritual community?
Well, let me just touch two things before I pass it to Rory. One, some spaces are already interspiritual without needing to appeal to us and how we're defining things,
Mm-hmm.
In conversations with you, you've brought up ecstatic dance community, which is a spiritual space, but is not defined by one religion
Mm-hmm.
or even two religions. It's an interspiritual space. So there are interspiritually oriented communal spaces now, but they don't have a cohesive identity in terms of, you might say, a theology of interspirituality.
Right.
And there may be some implicit theology there, but people haven't articulated it together. But one thing to say about Charis meditation, before we talk about how we do community, is that Charis meditation unlike some other descriptions of meditation, isn't only the vertical dimension, going high and deep. For it to be Charis meditation in the way we hold it, and this is a little different than centering prayer, is that it has to have both dimensions, the vertical and the horizontal. So you haven't done it until you've already added in that horizontal dimension. So there might be a tranquility-based practice, but then afterward, this will be different for everybody, but you might keep a little book next to you of, things that inspire you. And it might be Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, or it could be a pocket Rumi, or you could go for a walk, or maybe you listen to a particular, podcast that has spiritual content. So you're feeding your horizontal dimension, how you integrate what you experience in the meditation into your life and life experience. And that will include values, vows, spiritual direction, some aspect of that. So that's just to say, for us, Charis meditation is the two coordinates together. And that's how we were talking about the most simplified basis of an interspiritual path going forward has to have both of those coordinates.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
And then to address the question of community, we started to talk about Charis Circles. And if Rory wants to talk about that, I've already hit this, so maybe he can extend it with that.
Okay. Yeah. I'll kind of lead this up to the way that Charis is building communities now in our Charis Circles, which I think both Nathaniel and I think is turning out to be a very successful endeavor. There's things of great beauty growing there, and it's feeding people in a deep way that I don't even think we expected when we first created them.
Definitely.
And really forming a sense of community. So there's something really beautiful happening there. And before I get into it, I kind of want to back up a little bit and just say, a little bit about what Charis has grown out of. So we might have talked about this on the first podcast. I can't remember, but, I was the administrator and participated in Father Thomas Keating's Snowmass Interspiritual Dialogue Fellowship for its final 5 years. And then Charis started up a new iteration of those dialogues called the Charis Snowmass Dialogues. And we should mention Nathaniel wrote the book on the first 20 years of that dialogue called The Common Heart. So we had a lot of immersion in the kind of energy and community that was created out of advanced teachers and practitioners from different religious traditions coming together in deep dialogue in a retreat setting for, 5 days to a week every year, over 30 years. And as we carried on the dialogues, we began to form a kind of community group of us, of people who are, some of them, considered very high-level teachers in their traditions, who have their own communities and students that they're teaching. And we formed such a bond that we've been working together in community for years now, including developing an interspiritual formation program that would even last a couple of years. We haven't quite launched yet, but the care that's been put into it is in the fact that 5 or 6 of us who have very limited time have spent 3 or 4 years now consistently meeting about it. Not just launching something, not just each person teaching from their tradition, but actually what does it mean in an interspiritual context? And so forming that kind of community and that energy, I think, is the key to Charis's particular success at creating interspiritual community. And so that spirit is then flown into our Charis circles, which on the outside looks very simple, very simple. A simple practice of our Charis meditation, followed by a communal reading practice that we actually took from the ancient monastic practice of collatio. But what you find when you do it in this way is something profound happens. You have people from all different walks of life, different traditions, finding something that they can come together and practice. And in that silent meditation session, you don't have to do Charis meditation. That's just what the facilitator will offer for those who don't have a practice, but some sort of silent meditation practice, which there's a whole spectrum of. But in the silence itself, begins to weave community, but it still remains not quite embodied. It remains felt and people resonate with it. But then in the reading practice, it's like all of these strands begin to become embodied. And it has a kind of free-flowing nature that allows for spontaneity, but also a form which contains it and allows everyone to share from their experience of the journey, which is so important, and their experience of life in a way that other people can learn from, so that we're now all hearing from, witnessing, listening to, and learning from each other, which is the heart of any community, but not necessarily in a way where we are all believe in the same theology, or we're all doing even the same spiritual practices, or walking the same path. And so, the only type of community is not one where everyone believes the same thing and practices the same way. In fact, one of the great challenges of our times is how to form community amongst real diversity, not around a theory about diversity or around ideological discourse about diversity that doesn't actually allow for diversity, but how to really be present to diverse paths and peoples and yet form community, which has at its heart deep sharing, listening, learning from each other, and growing together on a spiritual path. And I think that's what we've created in a simple way with Charis Circles. It allows people to form interspiritual communities of practice without asking them to all share the same theology or the same perspective on the journey or even the same practices around it. And we're finding it, at least at this point, to be quite successful, I think.
Yeah. And, one of the things they end up sharing, and this is necessary to make it work, usually they share values, and the value is around respecting diversity and wanting to be in community with one another. And so there is a shared value there. But with the Charis Circles, in a way, it's a communal extension of Charis Meditation in its two dimensions. And so in the Charis Circle, you're doing in a group what you would be doing in Charis Meditation alone. So in a group, we explore a vertical dimension at once together. So you're in a circle. You can imagine all the pillars going vertically in that circle off of each individual. And then in the second part of the practice, we turn, to the horizontal dimension and do what we would call a collective contemplation. And really, because there's a kind of reading to respond to, we get to witness one another's contemplation on the reading. And in witnessing it, we're enriched by the diversity of response. And so what's fantastic, and Rory's referring to, we've seen something beautiful grow out of it. We see community growing out of it. So they're not at that point in that stage of a practice, because it is a practice. They're not talking to each other. They're witnessing each other. So you've done meditation and you're doing contemplation, and it's still being held as a ritual. But when people have witnessed each other, heard each other, witnessed their diversity and the profundity of their responses to kind of sacred content, and the readings can be anything from a Rumi poem to, verses from the Bhagavad Gita, they feel more connected. When the practice is over, their conversation is more rich. There's more quality to it. There's more respect in it. And so we're finding that community is growing out of a collective ritual that is being done together.
Yeah.
So before we close here, is there any other Charis activity that it's worth shouting out in this context in terms of what Charis is doing to support interspiritual practitioners, either individually or communally? So far, I think we've named Charis Meditation, Charis Circles, Charis Dialogues, which we've talked a fair amount about at this point in various episodes, and the forthcoming, it sounds like, Charis Interspiritual Formation Program.
I hear we have a podcast.
Yes, we also have a podcast.
Which in some ways has been one of the richest things for us, is the response to the podcast. In the early days when we didn't have much to offer, one of the things we thought we could offer is that we have rich discussions with each other. The people in our community, many of the people that have been on the podcast are connected to our Charis Interspiritual community, whether it's Brenda Salgado or Chris Maddox or the Venerable Pandavati, etc. And when we would have those people in dialogue, and we'd have those rich dialogues, because they're in private retreat, the constant question was like, oh, I wish I could be there. How could I be there? But they're private retreats. And so the podcast was actually our response to say, oh, we do have wonderful talks. Why don't we let everybody listen in? And so this has been like, a joyful kind of outgrowth of Charis Foundation. And you've been a, really integral part of making it happen. But the thing I want to mention, it's not so much an activity, but as we witness and respond to that question about what am I going to do as an interspiritual practitioner, or what am I going to do with this impulse? And so there's meditation practice, there's contemplation, but in as much as our interspirituality has been connected to new monasticism, and you've mentioned that with Rory and Adam's book, The New Monasticism, we really considered what it would mean to have a vowed life as an interspiritual practitioner. In terms of what you're going to be doing day to day as an individual, interacting with vows or in profound intentions about how I want to be living is one of the most important things you can be doing.
Right.
And so we evolved a set of 12 vows. And not just, it wasn't like Rory and I in a room sketching things out with pen and paper. It wasn't that at all. There was an early iteration of vows that were based on some teachings of Brother Wayne Teasdale, again, who was a monk, who coined the word interspiritual. And Reverend Diane Burke created a set of simplified vows out of 9 sections of a book that he wrote. And we took that as a basis into dialogue with this community that Rory's mentioned, of people that we're doing lateral formation with, people like the Venerable Pandavati and Joshin Burns Roshi and Chris Maddox and Alejandro Warden. And we were all talking together, and we looked at these vows and explored them. And we, over a period, rewrote them to catch our diversity. And so there is a set of 12 vows that represents what these 6 people understood about what was necessary in a journey, and we tried to embody them there. So that's a thing. While it's not an activity, we offer it as a resource for living a interspiritual life, in a serious way. And I don't know, maybe Rory can think of some of the other things we're doing. I know we've got like 14 activities now.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a few plugs, I guess, that came up I could throw in. But just to say on the vows, we did come up with them with the 6 of us and worked on them, and they came from Brother Wayne. We also used some of Howard Thurman's work that came out of his Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. And they really are the heart or the ethos of our Charis community. So we put those vows at the center of the Charis community, and they are potentially something that those who want to live a deeper new monastic life could grow into, even taking in a formal way over a period of 5 to 7 years or so, is what it's envisioned. Just like a kind of normal monastic novitiate that leads to final vows, but they capture the heart of who we are. So they're important. You can see them on our website, the charisinterspirituality.org. And then, there are 2 other activities that I would throw out there as part of what we're doing. One is the Keating Schachter Center for Interspirituality at Naropa University. And Natanel's the director for that, but we sponsor week-long residencies for authentic spiritual teachers from different traditions each semester. And they not only give talks and interact with students, but they also interact with staff and professors in trying to change, affect some of the culture. And in fact, the one coming up, not this spring, but in the fall, will be centered a lot on dialogue and a project we're involved with called the Shared Sacred Story from Fetzer Institute. And we did a Shared Sacred Story of Interspirituality alongside of 8 other religious traditions that did a Shared Sacred Story of Buddhism and of Christianity and of Confucianism. And so, it really holds up kind of the values that we've been talking about for students and for young people, many who are spiritual but not religious, but again, who recognize spiritual depth. And depth calls to depth. You don't have to be in the same person's tradition. You don't have to be walking the same path. But all of a sudden, when you see spiritual depth, it touches you at the same place. Something inside us resonates with it. And so they begin to get perspectives from different traditions and see them upheld with respect and dignity, and also a chance to dialogue without the end of the dialogue being assumed you're going to be funneled into some particular tradition or path. So that really helps to uphold the values. And then I think it's worth mentioning also our retreat center, Charis Mandala Sanctuary in New Mexico, where I'm currently at, talking to you from. But we have a retreat center down here. And this summer, we are beginning, in addition to holding our Charis Circle training retreats, it's a 6-month facilitation training and some centering prayer retreats, we're beginning to explore what it looks like for us to hold some longer 10-day retreats, and moving somewhat into the role of what does it look like to really teach the spiritual path by exploring different perspectives towards it. So, for instance, we'll do an introductory retreat called Stages of the Path, which will be a 10-day retreat and include silence and meditation, but will also be taught by both me and Nathaniel, as well as Alejandra Warden, who's our director of the Charis Circles and has long experience in Sufism as well as the sacred feminine. Wonderful teaches on the sacred feminine. She was on one of our podcasts. But, in that retreat, we'll not only teach meditation, a silent meditation, but we'll begin to explore how is this contemplative path seen at, say, from the Christian perspective? And how is it seen from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective? And how is it seen from the Sufi perspective? And then it kind of gives us an overview of the path, but in a way where we're exploring the teachings from different traditions and not necessarily trying to funnel people into this or that, but really seeing where that impulse is in them that you talked about, Daniel, and how we can water it and what intuitions we have as particular teachings or a particular person or readings that might help water that impulse for them. And you begin to recognize different stages people are at in the path, and you can kind of talk to them sometimes about it if it's something that you've maybe been through before. Experience is a wonderful teacher. So we're beginning to experiment with that, which is another way of not only building community, but building path into the inner spiritual work, at least that Charis is doing.
Beautiful. I'm disappointed I didn't get all my questions answered. It's not crystal clear how one walks an interspiritual path. So I think we failed here in terms of answering all questions comprehensively. But Sylvie, I think this has to be our closing despite that. And so I'm wondering, to close us out, Rory, if you can share a poem or quote or something. I don't think I preempted you mistakenly, so I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay. Give me 1 second. I think what Nathaniel and I would like to do is just take turns reading our Charis Community Vows that we talked about.
That's great.
So I'll just start with the first one, and then Nathaniel and I will just alternate. You'll see that they kind of grow out from our own individual practice to that horizontal dimension that we talked about that is embracing the whole world by the time we come to the 12th vow. So 1, to pursue a deeper understanding of life and reality, both the knowledge and the mystery at the center of all being.
2, to live in solidarity with all life and creation, recognizing everything as sacred and interconnected.
3, to refrain from harmful thoughts, words, or deeds, seeking a mutually beneficial relationship with all life and creation.
4, to live a life committed to spiritual practice, embodied in periods of contemplation and skillful action in the world.
5, to cultivate responsibility and mature self-understanding through an honest investigation of my own motives and actions.
6, to cultivate forgiveness and generosity for myself and others, as well as joy, appreciation, and acceptance in all aspects of my life.
7. To live a life of grateful humility, remembering all the sources of sustenance, refuge, and help that I have received, and which I continue to receive.
8. To live a life of simplicity, clarifying my own needs and relationship to the earth in support of its continued life and health.
9. To live a life of compassionate service and loving action, understanding that we live because and not in spite of one another.
10. To be a voice for justice, compassion, and transformation in the world, acting not only from my own limited understanding, but listening attentively to the one voice that speaks through and for all being.
11. To unite in contemplative fellowship with people of all cultures, ethnicities, and religions, sharing our spiritual growth and an ethical awareness of one another.
And 12. To cultivate sacred relationship and reciprocity with nature, the cosmos, and all being.
Amen.
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 Thanks, y'all.
Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.